After the 2 decades-long US occupation of Afghanistan, what lies ahead? Will Afghanistan descend into another chaotic breeding ground for terrorists, as alleged by many in the West? Or will it, finally rid of a corrupt and murderous occupation, be able to determine its destiny, as many hope, if very cautiously? Hello, this is Radhika Desai for the Real News Network. To a world used to considering the US an all-powerful power, its sudden and ignominious withdrawal from Afghanistan and the equally swift collapse of the government and army it had propped up for decades were stunning. Few doubt that these events will constitute a major milestone and likely marked an acceleration of the long drawn-out process of US decline. No one watching the events as they have unfolded over the past month and more can doubt that they will have vast implications for Afghanistan, for the region, and for the world. There has already been a flood of commentary around the world, offering different perspectives on key questions. Why did the US withdraw? How could the Taliban take over so swiftly and so bloodlessly? How could the US have occupied Afghanistan for 20 years, only to return it to the very forces it had fought so hard? How credible was the US claim that it was withdrawing from Afghanistan in order to concentrate on the China challenge, if the US presence in Afghanistan was a key piece of essentially creating problems for China, particularly given that Afghanistan borders on Xinjiang? On September the 7th, after putting down a local revolt in the Panjshir Valley, the Taliban announced a new government, which many countries are ready to deal with. So now it is time to distill the wisdom of the debate and discussion so far on the US withdrawal and look to the future. Where does Afghanistan go from here? What is the social character of the new government and state? What new relations and realities are emerging on the ground in Afghanistan? What new international alliances and equations are appearing? Particularly, how are Afghanistan's neighbors, which include China, Russia, Iran, Pakistan, and the Central Asian republics of Tajikistan and Uzbekistan, not to mention the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, how are all these entities relating to the new Taliban government? Will they permit the US to re-enter Afghanistan as important forces in the United States hope? If not, can the much talked about over-the-horizon capability the US claims actually work for its purposes? What is the effect of all this on India, which in recent decades has been trying to position itself as the US's loyal servant in the region, particularly as its counterweight to China, not to mention India's long-standing rivalry with Pakistan? With me to discuss all this is M.K. Bhadrakumar. It is no exaggeration to say that he's one of the most qualified to speak on the matter. He was a career diplomat representing India in many of the countries of the region, and he's one of the most widely read bloggers on foreign policy issues through his blog, Indian Punchline. Most recently, he has written a 20-part commentary on the evolving situation in Afghanistan. M.K. Bhadrakumar was posted to the capitals of the former Soviet Union and was head of the Pakistan, Iran, Afghanistan division and Kashmir unit of the Indian Ministry of External Affairs. After retiring from his last posting in Turkey nearly 2 decades ago, he has been a writer and columnist and has contributed to Indian and foreign publications. He writes on India's foreign policy, regional and global affairs with a focus on China, Russia, and Central Asia, the Middle East, and South Asia. He currently divides his time between New Delhi and his hometown in South India. Welcome to the Real News Network, Bhadra.
Thank you, Radhika. It's a pleasure and it's a great privilege to be interviewed by you, a great scholar I have always regarded and respected. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Bhadra, let's begin with an overview of where the couple of months have left the United States in Afghanistan. And once we've laid that groundwork, we'll be ready to talk about the future of Afghanistan and the region as it is being remade and what all that implies for the world order. So my first question to you is, what were the causes and the significance of the US withdrawal when all is said and done? If you were to sort of give us a synoptic view of what it means and why it happened, please.
Radhika, it's a long story in the sense that we must go back to the genesis of it, which is how the intervention began, the invasion of Afghanistan began. This was really an accidental war in the sense that the new American century, which was being planned at that time by the neocons in the US and senior officials in the Bush administration, they had in the crosshairs actually three other countries, that is Iran, Syria, and Iraq, not Afghanistan. Then the 9/11 attacks came, and the Bush administration was so much on the defensive domestically that it had to be seen as doing something. And that's the kind of beginning that this intervention had. Originally to bribe or pay the Northern Alliance field commanders and warlords and get them to do the job to overthrow the Taliban regime. The fact of the matter is that the Taliban had sent overtures to the US that on this vexed question of Osama bin Laden's handing over, they were prepared to negotiate. That was an offer from Mullah Omar himself. Similarly, on the part of the Northern Alliance, they had absolutely no intentions of seeking American intervention. The American intervention was something which the Bush administration decided. And when the first American aircraft landed with troops in Bagram airport after the overthrow of the Taliban regime, which was achieved by the Northern Alliance, the then foreign minister in the Northern Alliance government, Abdullah, a very well-known name today, he protested. He said that the Americans came without the consent of the Afghan government. Now, you can imagine the situation. And the Russians actually landed an aircraft at that time in Bagram, and there was a kind of a face-off. And the Russians then discreetly took away their aircraft from there. So this is the backdrop, you know. So you see, after getting into this, they saw that it was so easily they achieved the overthrow of the Taliban regime. And then immediately after that, you know, this actually went to the back burner. That is, after they had removed the Northern Alliance government against its wishes by getting the help from other countries to persuade them to step down, that is, including Iran, including Zarif himself, former Foreign Minister Zarif, who was at the Bonn conference at that time, to persuade the Northern Alliance not to create a ruckus over this, step aside, let the Americans put somebody that they are comfortable with. And that's how Karzai came. And at that time, giving way to Karzai, the president of the Northern Alliance government, Burhanuddin Rabbani, in fact made a statement which I still recall. He said that, I hope that this is the last time in the history of our country that a foreigner will dictate who should be the ruler. So feelings were running high. So immediately after this much was achieved in putting a puppet or whatever you call it, a surrogate or someone in power in Kabul, and then the Americans turned to their real agenda, which was to go after Iraq. Because as I mentioned to you, the New American Century project, where the American hegemony would be consolidated through the 21st century, it was beginning with these chapters, the three regime changes in these three countries. So the Iraq invasion, which is totally, we all know that, in very contrived fashion, it began like this, and the Americans, the ease with which the regime was overthrown, the Americans were all confident that the mission accomplished, as Bush said, announced, you know, so immediately after the overthrow of Saddam. But then that's where the trouble began. You know, the resistance grew, and the Americans got into a quagmire there, and much destruction and killings followed, and millions of people were displaced, refugees and all that. And the entire thing took an entirely very different complexion. They got bogged down in Iraq, finally leading to their eviction from Iraq. because the parliament decided that the Americans must leave.
Must leave.
And that's how they
Absolutely.
left. They didn't leave on their own accord.
That's right.
They were
Absolutely.
booted out of Iraq, actually,
Yes.
in Barack Obama's time.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you see, their plan for Syria is already afoot before the Iraq invasion. Because they had originally wanted Syria, because why Syria? Syria is very important because it affects Israel's security directly. And for Israel to have total dominance over the Levant and to the annexation of Golan to be formalized, Syria had to be weakened, destroyed. So you see, Syria was the priority, but they went for Iraq. There again, they got the confidence, but they got bogged down. And when they bogged down, Assad is not such a simple character, not this Assad, his father was not a simple character. He made things difficult, and he made sure, let me put it like this, he made sure that the Americans wouldn't leave Iraq in a conceivable future.
Yes.
He assisted the opposition forces, in other words, ensured that the Americans were bled in Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
Iran initially supported the intervention in the sense, or rather encouraged the intervention insofar as getting rid of Saddam was an old dream for the Iranians. After the Iran-Iraq war, the bitterness was still there in their mind. So they were applauding and encouraging the overthrow of the regime. But then after that, naturally, once they introduced this democratic government, democratic process and all that, the empowerment of the Shias began. And naturally, Iran became the most influential power in that country. And then they got locked into a conflict with the Americans there. So the friction began, rather. They didn't really confront the Americans or anything, but friction began there. So for all these reasons, they got bogged down in Iraq. Mm-hmm. Iran was spared, and then Syria was spared, but Syria is a different story. Then Arab Spring came, and it took a very different thing. American got a window of opportunity to intervene in Syria. So you see, the point I made in the beginning was, let me resume from there, that this is not pre-planned. So from 2003 onward, they paid very little attention.
Yes.
And let me bring in also a factual detail, which is extremely important to recall, which is this, that at that point in time, in 2002, immediately after the overthrow, in fact, a few months after the overthrow, 1 year after the overthrow, the Taliban made an overture to Karzai that they would like to get to the mainstream politics in Afghanistan, and they would like to work like a political party. And that the Americans spurned that offer, from the overture from the Taliban. And then the Taliban retreated, and then they started recouping, and the rest is history. Mm-hmm. So you see, by the time the Americans came out of Iraq, really bruised, and the whole backdrop was very complicated by that time already. Barack Obama came, his presidency came. And his presidency, Barack Obama also as a candidate had argued for ending this war. But then the so-called deep state, that is the Pentagon, the CIA, and including Hillary Clinton, who was actually at that time the power alignments were such that she was with the CIA and the Pentagon and so on at that time. Bob Woodward's book narrates this in some detail. Mm-hmm. Paradoxically, the only person who opposed at that time was Joe Biden. Mm-hmm. When the proposal for this surge came up before Obama. And the book narrates that at one time, after going to the church on a Sunday morning, he went, Biden was feeling so disturbed that he went to Obama, mm-hmm. the White House, on a Sunday morning, and to tell Obama to have a one-to-one with him, to tell him that this is a very wrong decision, mm-hmm. have a surge, because then you are actually going into a war which is going to be through your presidency. You will not be able to wind it up. This is a war that cannot be won,
Yes, absolutely.
therefore, the first reason and the foremost reason I would actually put like this, that Biden came with a determination. Now, you know well enough and better than me that Obama was an outsider in terms of the US establishment in the Beltway. He had very little familiarity with foreign affairs. But Biden is an enormously experienced man. And also he's been there throughout his adulthood. He was in the middle of it, the power play in the Beltway. And he knows how the system works. And he also knew how to get his decisions implemented. So he took this decision, and many reports came in New York Times and other papers also at that time that he overruled the advice of these people from the Pentagon and the CIA and so on. And he decided that, no, this withdrawal must be implemented.
Mm-hmm.
So you see, I put Biden as the first factor there, for this withdrawal from. Now, he didn't do anything other than what Trump wanted. Mm-hmm. But Trump was again an outsider.
Yes.
And none of the decisions, very few decisions he wanted to take, including starting from improvement of relations with Russia. He couldn't proceed with that. He was constantly, they were being derailed by the deep state in the US. So Trump also finally gave up because he had the decision, but it was never implemented. So now, why did Biden do this? Therefore, that is what we have to firstly understand. Biden clearly understood, and the military people were also honest enough to admit it, that this is not a war which can be won. Then Biden was forceful enough to then address this question that if this is a war which cannot be won, then what is the point in fighting it for one more year? It will become 4 more years. It will become 10 more years. Are you going to be within sight of victory? They say, no, sir, it's not possible. This has to be a political settlement. So if it is a political settlement, what's the point in doing that? Then comes the other attendant questions about the enormous amount of money that is going into it. Now, this is also very relevant here because this has become a $1 trillion war. And so much of money is going in, and that kind of money, when it appears suddenly in a very poor country with hardly any absorption capacity, it spawns corruption. So all this is a vicious circle, and corruption means, at an incredible level, it is there. And this affects the war. This affects the morale of the military. You come to a situation where the ordinary soldiers don't get their salary for 3 months, 6 months, because the officers just pocket the money. It's unbelievable. And these troops are so they have to, how do they support their families? They sell the weapons in the market.
Yeah.
And much of it goes to the Taliban.
So
this is kind of thing.
Yeah, so if I may resume, I think what you're doing is, on the one hand, you are pointing out that the withdrawal from Afghanistan is part of a larger picture of failure in the region on the part of the United States. And on the other hand, you've also pointed out that in all of these countries, and certainly in Afghanistan, there was always resentment about having a puppet government foisted upon them, one that did not represent them properly, and so on. And of course, as you now point out, the very manner in which the war was conducted gave rise to a corrupt government, a corrupt army, which then evaporated in the face of the Taliban takeover. So perhaps, so this is one of the reasons why there was a swift and bloodless takeover. So now, if we may move to the second question that I have, which is, given what we know of the Taliban, how can we expect them to rule in the coming months and years? What social interests do they represent? Do they, of course, they represent the resentment at a puppet foreign government, etc. But what else do they represent?
They represent the Pashtuns. And when you say Afghan, actually most Afghanistan people will know that, will admit it. When you say Afghan, you actually mean Pashtun.
Yes.
They are interchangeable words in the Afghan context. So you see the centrality of the Pashtun in the power calculus is a historical reality. So what we have seen now through this period of the war is actually an aberration. The Tajiks, who form something like 25 to 26% of the population, they became the ruling elite, and the last phase of the war I'm narrating to you, the officer corps in the army, they're all Tajiks, and they're fighting the Pashtun. And now Pashtuns are close to 45 to 50% of the population.
Yes.
They were virtually, this is an empowerment for the Pashtun.
Mm-hmm.
I used an expression in a recent writing, ethno-nationalism. So to answer your question, this certainly gives great impetus. When you see demonstrations in Kabul, many people do not understand that over time, Kabul became a Tajik city.
Yes.
Whereas the hinterland in the south, where the teeming millions of Pashtuns live, they never really mattered. Occasionally, it would come in the discourses in the country. Even in newspapers, I used to see sometimes this surfacing, this strong feeling. So this undercurrent, and I don't think that the Northern Alliance people would ever be able to have an appeal, or rather the non-Taliban people will ever be able to have an appeal in that way in the Pashtun constituency that the Taliban has, So this is a very important thing.
That's
Second
really...
thing is,
mm-hmm. Go ahead. No, please go ahead.
Yeah. The second point is, that despite all these aberrations during their first shot at ruling the country, the fact is they give stability, order. Mm-hmm. Of course, they resorted to extreme measures, but they gave primacy to human security. It's ironically, I can't put it in any other way.
Yeah.
The lawlessness in Afghanistan, Taliban came itself as a reaction to the lawlessness of the Mujahideen period. So you see, they even today you find odd interviews coming from the interior. In American papers, I have read also, like people are. New York Times had a fascinating dispatch from somewhere in the countryside in rural Afghanistan about 4 or 5 days ago. A long essay on that. A man took the trouble to go there and to see how those people are looking. So they were actually quite pleased that there is at least certain predictability about life, because when you speak about human security, it is raw. It's really, a matter of, you don't know whether you're going to be alive tomorrow.
Absolutely.
Now, and family honor, everything is at stake there. So, that way, there is a certain kind of a stability which people will appreciate. This is the second factor. Now, the important thing that we need to talk about is their weaknesses. One is that, that they don't have cannot put it differently, a managerial cadre. Now, I have dealt with them. I have been familiar with them during their first time as rulers in the second half of the 1990s. At that time, virtually Pakistanis went there and were running the government. The military was having a fairly good officer content from the Pakistani military, ex-service, and so on. Yeah. And even in the running of the ministries in Kabul or in the provinces, Pakistani civil servants or retired people were officiating. So you see the dearth of talent. This is where I think the Americans have done a dastardly thing by this sort of brain drain. They should never have done.
Yes.
It is getting this kind of a brain drain. It is getting this kind of people when the Warsaw Pact collapsed and the Soviet Union collapsed, from those countries where the social formation was high, but it's a different matter to bleed a country like Afghanistan, because its margin is so little, So the best and the brightest, when they go out from there, there's nothing. It's like a husk, that country. This is
Mhm.
going to be a major thing.
Yes,
Then, secondly, the problem they have is that they're flat broke. They've inherited a treasury which has got no money.
that's right. Well, the
All this-
Americans emptied it.
yeah, Americans, Ghani, everyone, they just took away all the money. So how do you run a country without any kind of money? And then the little bit money that they had in the American banks, immediately overnight they froze their accounts.
Yeah.
So they don't have access to that money. Otherwise, it's something like about $9 billion would have been available with them, that they took away. Then they imposed sanctions immediately. And they have told the World Bank and the IMF and all that to just suspend all programs there. So the challenge facing them is, how do they run the country? And then, you look at the kind of vengeance, that they had. They 2 days, 48 hours or 24 hours before vacating Kabul airport, there were so many civilian aircraft parked there. They just went and destroyed all of them. They destroyed all the equipments in the airport.
Yes, that's right.
Now, you see, this is clearly to make it horribly difficult for these people to settle in. So this is the problem.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so I mean, what you're also saying is that the Americans are, in a very important respect, the architects of the unfolding humanitarian disaster that is already being talked about in Afghanistan, with a government deprived of funds and so on, and is sanctioned and so on. Just one other question about the character of this government. So, practically every country, and certainly all the countries with important stakes in the region, like China and Russia and whatever, they have all been saying that that the Taliban should create an inclusive government. And it's very clear from the September 7 government that was announced that it is certainly, while there are a couple of non-Pashtuns in there, it's not particularly inclusive. So can you comment a little bit on that? And also, given how much the issue of women and plays in the West, particularly the issue of Afghan women and their future, maybe you can comment a little bit on that in terms of what we should expect from the Taliban government and why.
It's a complex issue because unless you relate their behavior to their flow of history and their traditions, we will not be able to understand it. Because I don't know if you came across this about 2-3 weeks ago, there was a wonderful essay in the New Yorker magazine by Anand Gopal. I don't know if the name is familiar to you. No. He's a fantastic book he had written in 2015. I always thought that he was one of the best chroniclers of the Afghan war. Now, Anand Gopal I think he was working for Washington Post at the time. He wrote an essay, and the title itself, I don't need to explain what it must be containing. You can figure out The Other Afghan Women.
Yes.
That's the title of that
Very
essay.
important. Yes.
Now, and that speaks volumes, that title. That the Afghanistan that these people, starting from Madeleine Albright, down to present day, when we speak about the women, they are the English-speaking women, the urban women, who've been probably educated even in the West, a number of them, and who are active in the social circles in Kabul, westernized lifestyles. So these are the women that we are talking about. When you go to the interior, you come across, and I have traveled extensively in that country, you come across a very different reality. It's a traditional society. It's a traditional society where a woman doesn't mind that if, she's sequestered from men. And if, her husband and, her brothers and father, they don't allow her to interact freely with men. And she goes to the seclusion of the home when outsiders come, and she doesn't move around. These are social norms, like even I'm very sure that there is so much of difference even between South India and North India. Our societies are all, transforming. And a lot of tension is building up also because nowadays, in this age, the transformation is so rapid and the time is becoming compressed.
Mhm.
So a lot of disjointed things taking place even in India today as a result
Yes.
of that.
Yes.
So, this social, it is a matter which is directly linked to social formation.
Yeah.
Now, this is where even the communist government faltered. They tried to modernize, at breakneck speed, and the country
Yes.
wasn't ready. And the
Mhm.
traditional society disobeyed.
Mhm.
And then the Mujahideen came out of that,
Yes.
to organize the resistance. So you see, Taliban, therefore, cannot be expected to have behavioral norms that you would in Canada or I in India would think as a civilized way of life. Maybe our civilized way of life is not civilized enough even for you. But so it clearly shows that, that it's a relative matter.
Yes.
So this is the important thing to understand. But having said that, I genuinely feel that they are different today
Mhm.
because I have seen them, I have talked to them, I have interacted with them in the 1990s. You
Mhm.
mentioned about my career track as the head of the Pakistani Afghanistan Iran division. Before that, I was there also in Kabul looking after the embassy for a while. So,
Right.
I know the country very well and I've dealt with them for something like 15, 20 years while in the
Yes.
foreign service. So the Taliban that I have known in the 1990s are not the Taliban that I am seeing today. I can tell
Yes.
you that.
Mm.
Therefore, the statements that they have made about their willingness to have a more inclusive government, that is something, to take that point first, that is something which has not been tested so far.
Mhm.
I will take them for their word when they say that this is an interim government. And this is an interim government because they had to have some kind of a government because the country was just falling apart. To hold it together, that there is banking possible, there is schools are reopening, health clinics are reopening, etc. They needed ministries to start functioning. So they put together an interim government. So you see, the jury is still out on that. And
Yes.
this small beginning they have made is not very insignificant because one is a man from Panjshir as their commerce minister with cabinet rank. He's not a Taliban. He's just a normal civilian, a technocrat from Panjshir Valley. So
Mhm.
they are looking for this. And I read an interview by Hamid Karzai with the Iranian media about
Mhm.
4 5 days ago, and I get a feeling that that he's working hard on this, and he's constantly in touch with the Taliban, and he seemed already taking a different view of them as open to ideas and are acutely conscious of their inadequacies and are very unhappy with the state of affairs today. So
Yes.
there is no triumphalism in them, in other words. It's a very interesting interview. And Kazai is a very honest man in this respect that, that he stayed back there at taking enormous risk and preferred to be sharing the grief and joy of his people when all this began and the Taliban stormed the city and Ghani ran away from there.
Right.
So the jury is, in my opinion, still out.
Out.
Now, as far as the schooling and all is concerned, um, they have already said that they are going to allow girls to go to school, but this is where you come to the traditions and so on. Now, you cannot expect co-education to happen. Co-education, can you imagine in my childhood in that part of India, which is one of the best developed socially in the country, co-education was unheard of. I studied in a school which is just boys' school. My wife studied in a school which is just a girls' school. And I'm talking about the 1960s.
Mhm.
So, society has changed. Now it is possible. You go to the same school. My granddaughter goes to a school, an American school, where there are children not only Indians, others, boys, etc., etc. Taliban has said that they are going to change, and they are going to allow the girls to go to school. And I read somewhere that maybe an announcement is due tomorrow on this issue by this weekend.
Right.
Now, a number of professions the women have been allowed to resume immediately. For instance, health, where
Exactly.
they're desperately needed there. Their services. So they all been actually ordered to return for work.
Yeah.
So you see, all those things are there, and in course of time, after all, you must understand that, and you're a scholar on Russian history. I told somebody recently this, that they've been there for 1 month. How long did Lenin take in similar conditions? Over 3 years to consolidate his
Yes.
revolution. So,
Right.
we are actually putting a tall order in and doing this stock taking in 1 month's time. In my opinion, it's very unkind.
Yes.
Give them some time, they will do it. And with all the handicaps that they have also, we need to factor in that they just don't have the money, they don't have the expertise. All these things count.
Absolutely. And I also think that, of course, there is the Iran model where, women are not participating in the upper echelons of the government or anything. But if you look at their statistics on women's education, fertility, etc., they match any of the first world countries' statistics. So in that sense, women's situation is a complex affair in countries like Iran and so on. But that's really great. So you are, as you rightly say, I think that the new government has just taken power. The jury is still out. What's more, they themselves have said it's an interim government. We expect things to change. So that's really good. Now, I have just a couple more questions on this part of our interview on the US and Afghan situation.
Can I interrupt you for a minute?
Sure, of course.
One very important factor here is that in the 1990s, they were in the clutches of the Saudis. The Saudis were funding them, and they were eating out of the Saudi hands. And the Saudis introduced into the paradigm huge doses of Wahhabism.
Yes.
Now, after the overthrow, sitting in the wilderness, pondering over their future, these Talibs understood that that was their undoing, in fact. That is what took them to Osama bin Laden.
Fascinating, yes.
And today, they have dissociated themselves. Why the international media is underplaying this, I do not understand. When they announced, that for their inauguration of their government, they wanted certain countries to be present. Saudi Arabia and the Emiratis didn't figure in that.
Very interesting.
And their top man, Khairkava, gave an interview, in fact, to the Iranian television. I saw that. It was a fascinating interview. He there underscored that in the recent years, we have not even visited Saudi Arabia. So they have actually analyzed and they have understood where they went horribly wrong, that they became the captives of this sort of a bizarre ideology.
Correct.
Today they are actually today copying, I'm watching it very closely, copying many characteristics of the regime in Iraq. Now you see in Iran. Now you see this is a Pashtun movement, but copying rather the Iranian model. The Islam that is there in Afghanistan is traditional Islam.
Yes.
It's not fanatical. It is Sufi Islam, and that they're mystical and that kind of thing. So you see, these people are immersed in the traditional Afghan Islam, and therefore I think that, I assess that the 1990s was a horrible mistake that they committed, which they realized and they have retracted. So their performance will need to be weighed in afresh now at this point in time, for this reason, that they are no longer in the clutches of the Saudis and in the shadows of the Wahhabism.
Very interesting. Now, just a couple more questions before we leave the matter of US and Afghanistan. So The US claims that they withdrew from Afghanistan in order to concentrate on dealing with the China challenge. But surely withdrawing from Afghanistan makes them less capable of dealing with the China challenge, at least as far as they're concerned, because they have, while they have been an occupying force in Afghanistan, certainly encouraging the East Turkestan Islamic movement, for example, in fomenting problems in Xinjiang, etc. So how do you think this withdrawal is going to affect the US-China equation? And on a more technical level, do you think that this so-called over-the-horizon capability that they think that they are going to maintain in order to continue to be a player in Afghan affairs is going to work?
This is a discussion really about American intentions. We analyzed partly the factors that were there for the American troop withdrawal from Afghanistan. But through this period of the negotiations, peace talks in Doha between the United States, Khalilzad, and the Taliban representatives, what the Americans were actually wanting to extract out of the Taliban was a matrix of understanding where a rather open-ended American intelligence military presence in Afghanistan would be feasible, would be allowed by the Taliban. So, so what the Americans were doing is that instead of a horribly expensive war like this, costing billions of dollars, they would cut down the expenses, and the agenda against China can still continue because it is going to be transferred to another plane. How did this Islamic State came about there? The Russians, the Chinese, the Iranians, they have all said. Hamid Karzai was the first one to mention that he had been getting reports in the night that unmarked helicopters were dropping people in remote regions of Afghanistan. And then the Russians and the Iranians have a very good intelligence system. So do the Russians in Iraq and Syria. And they spotted that American aircraft were airlifting the Islamic State fighters out of Syria, and they were being taken to Afghanistan. And then they were being deployed to different places, different pockets.
So you mean this is the origin of the ISIS Khorasan? ISIS
is a hydra-headed beast. Now, ISIS has, many kind of elements have come into it. After all, it's a composite movement of radical Islamists from Central Asia, from North Caucasus, from Xinjiang, even from Western countries, even from India to some extent, and Arab countries and so on. So, it is not that it is a monolithic movement. So in other words, in the name of the Islamic State, a lot of other people are also operating in Afghanistan today. There are other terrorist groups also operating there. Mm-hmm. But what I'm saying is there is a core group there of battle-hardened veterans, the Islamic State fighters who were defeated, who lost there, and have come, who have had full training and who have had, their baptism under fire, and they are the ones who are coming, and they are the ones also who migrated from this region to Syria, that is from Central Asian countries, North Caucasus, Xinjiang, and so on. For instance, the Uyghur, there are a few hundred Uyghurs, militants who have come there. Yeah. So, the American strategy was that if they can have a first-rate intelligence setup there, and they can have a small, viable force of special forces operating there with air cover, they can do wonders in terms of their real agenda, which is in terms of destabilizing Central Asia, destabilizing Chechnya and other places. Biden mentioned Chechnya again day before yesterday in his speech in the United Nations General Assembly. So, these things are still bothering them apparently,
Right.
China borders Afghanistan, and Wakhan corridor is a very difficult terrain.
Yes.
And according to reports which I have seen, China has also openly begun discussing this. the Trump administration removed the Uyghurs, the so-called ETIM, Eastern Turkestan movement, from the blacklist. So they are
Of
no
terrorists.
longer terrorists.
Yeah.
So, there is nothing preventing legally the Americans from hobnobbing with them. That is the meaning of it,
Yes.
And the Chinese have asked the Americans, but why don't you actually classify them as terrorists? Why this double standard? That is because they have used for these people as geopolitical tool. So, the withdrawal from Afghanistan is not going to have lead to any improvement in the relations. In fact, the Chinese have categorically said that no piecemeal selective engagement or cooperation is conceivable with the United States so long as it pursued hostile policies towards China and interfere in China's internal affairs. And knowing the Chinese, I'm sure this is the bottom line. They are not going to, and Taiwan and all this come into it. So the relationship is very difficult, and it is only going to get more tense.
So what you're saying, Badran, is that the United States intends to and is capable of having some sort of presence in Afghanistan, which they will use to continue to be a thorn in the side of China and Russia and the Central Asian states and so on.
Yeah, and Iran. Now, the expectation was that either Pakistan or the Taliban themselves directly would agree to a low-profile American presence in Afghanistan. But then this was not to be. Then the plan B was to organize a presence in Afghanistan's border radius, whether it's in Central Asian region or Pakistan or India included, etc. Now the Russians and the Chinese put their foot down and said, no way in Central Asia. So no Central Asian country agreed to give a facility for presence, American presence there. Pakistan just said that after we have gone through, it's just out of the question. And India, I don't know why they do not announce this, but they should announce this, that, that they should, why this ambivalence, was necessary at all. It is probably as a psychological pressure on Pakistan. I don't know. But I think it'll be very stupid on the part of India to, be part of this. And it's not in the Indian DNA. I don't see that is going to work. So then what happens? Then the nearest is Qatar.
Yes.
So how do you conduct an operation when a ground situation develops and via satellite and all that, you can beam the information back, somebody takes the decision, and where is the general sitting? In Florida. And from Florida, he immediately orders, a squadron of aircraft to leave from Qatar. It takes a few hours to reach there. No, this is not how you are going to fight terrorism, So the whole plan, plan unraveled. And some of this bitterness is showing in this kind of wanton destruction of equipments in Kabul airport and all that. They've left with a lot of bitterness, and humiliation. Bagram, leaving at midnight from out of Bagram, fearing that there might be, demonstrations against them from Afghan people. This is the kind of atmosphere in which they have left. So coming back, therefore, I think is going to be problematic.
Right. So this over the horizon capacity is more a myth than
I think it is unrealistic. I think the Brits wanted, in fact, a direct presence, and they have floated that idea. But the Taliban said very, very bluntly that they will not countenance any kind of foreign presence on their soil. And if any operations are to be undertaken, it should be undertaken by them. And the demand, the foreigners should make the demand on them to undertake this for security reasons, and they will handle it. So this being the state of play, a return is out of the question, And in any case, having left that place, I can be 100% sure that Russians and the Chinese are not going to allow the Americans to come back there.
Right.
Nor are the Iranians going to. So you see, this is out of the way. But to answer your question, this is not going to improve relations between the United States and China. because that is for entirely very many other factors are at work there.
Well, thank you so much. On that note, I think we will bring this interview to an end, but I'm sure we will be having lots of opportunities to talk to you again. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Radhika. It's a wonderful opportunity for me to discuss with someone who would respond